The night was thick with silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves as a cold wind swept through the grand estate. Under the dim glow of the street lamp, a woman stood at the towering gates of an opulent mansion, her hands trembling as she clutched the small hands of her 2 children. With one last, lingering look at their innocent faces, she whispered something inaudible, then turned and walked away into the darkness. As the woman disappeared into the night, the 2 children stood motionless, their wide eyes reflecting the golden glow of the mansion's windows. The older child, a girl no more than 10, tightened her grip on her younger brother's hand. He was barely 6, his small frame shivering, not just from the cold, but from fear. The iron gates loomed above them, locked and unwelcoming. The girl hesitated, then stepped forward and pressed the doorbell. A distant chime echoed through the estate, followed by a long silence. For a moment, they thought no one would answer. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate. The massive wooden doors creaked open, revealing a tall man in an expensive suit. His sharp eyes darted between the 2 children before settling on the girl. "Who are you?" he asked, his deep voice unreadable. The girl swallowed hard. "Our mother left us here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't react right away. He glanced over their shoulders, as if expecting to see someone watching from the darkness. Then, he stepped aside. "Come in." Hesitantly, the children crossed the threshold into the mansion. The air inside was warm, filled with the scent of polished wood and something faintly sweet, like vanilla and old books. The grand chandelier above them bathed the marble floors in golden light. But despite the beauty of the house, something felt off. As the door shut behind them with a heavy thud, the girl couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stepped into a place where they did not belong, and that their mother had known exactly what she was doing. The man led them through a long hallway, the children's footsteps barely making a sound on the polished marble floor. The girl held her brother's hand tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Sit here," the man said, gesturing toward a velvet sofa in an opulent sitting room. A large fireplace crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The girl hesitated. "Who are you?" she asked. The man studied her for a moment before answering. "Mr. Laurent, I own this house." She exchanged a glance with her brother. "Why did our mother leave us here?" Mr. Laurent didn't answer right away. Instead, he rang a small bell, and almost instantly, a maid appeared from the hallway. She was an older woman, her sharp eyes scanning the children with curiosity. "Give them something to eat," he ordered, "and prepare a room for them." The maid nodded and disappeared, leaving the children alone with Mr. Laurent once more. The girl's unease grew. "She's coming back, right?" she asked. Mr. Laurent sighed and sat in a large leather chair, his eyes, dark and unreadable, fixed on the girl. "Tell me something, child. What do you remember about your mother?" The girl frowned. "What do you mean? Has she ever mentioned this house before?" His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something that made the air feel heavy. The girl shook her head. "No, never." Mr. Laurent leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "Then why do you think she left you here?" The question sent a chill down the girl's spine. She didn't know the answer, but deep inside, she had a sinking feeling that whatever the truth was, it was something she wasn't ready to hear. Suddenly, her little brother tugged at her sleeve. She turned to him, expecting to see fear in his eyes. But instead, he looked excited. "Sister," he whispered, "I know this place." The girl froze. "What?" He pointed toward the grand staircase at the end of the hall. "I've been here before." Mr. Laurent's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. "Interesting," he murmured. The girl's mind raced. Their mother had never brought them here. So how could her brother recognize the mansion? And more importantly, why had their mother abandoned them in a place that already seemed to know them? The girl's breath caught in her throat. Her brother's words echoed in her mind. "I've been here before." She turned to him, gripping his shoulders. "What do you mean? How could you have been here?" The boy furrowed his brows, as if trying to remember something just out of reach. "I don't know, but I remember those stairs." He pointed toward the grand staircase. "And that chandelier. I think I played here before." Mr. Laurent observed them in silence, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest of his chair. Then, he stood, Come with me. The girl hesitated, but her brother slipped his hand from hers and followed the man without fear. She had no choice but to go after them. They climbed the grand staircase, their footsteps swallowed by the thick carpet. At the top, Mr. Laurent led them down a dimly lit corridor lined with old paintings. The girl shuddered as she noticed the faces in the portraits. They seemed to watch her, their eyes gleaming in the candlelight. Finally, they reached a door at the end of the hall. Mr. Laurent pushed it open, revealing a large room bathed in moonlight. Dust danced in the air, and the scent of something old and forgotten filled the space. The boy gasped, "I know this room." He ran inside, his small hands brushing against the wooden furniture as if confirming something. "There was a toy chest here," he said, pointing to an empty corner, "and a big bed with blue sheets." The girl's heart pounded. "How do you know that?" Mr. Laurent stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Because this was his room." The girl's blood ran cold. "What?" Mr. Laurent looked down at the boy. "You lived here, years ago." The boy's eyes widened. "I did?" Mr. Laurent nodded. "And your mother, she used to work here." The girl's head spun. None of this made sense. Their mother had never mentioned this place, never spoken of working in a mansion. And if her brother had lived here before, why didn't she remember? Why didn't she tell us? She whispered. Mr. Laurent's face darkened, because she was hiding something. A deep silence filled the room, thick with unspoken secrets. The girl's hands curled into fists. And for the first time, she felt it, the weight of a past they had never been meant to uncover. The girl's stomach twisted with unease. Her mother, hiding something? That didn't make sense. She turned to her brother, but he was too busy exploring the room, his small fingers tracing patterns on the dusty furniture. It was as if being here stirred something deep inside him, memories just beyond his grasp. She faced Mr. Laurent, her voice sharp. What was she hiding? The man hesitated, his gaze lingering on the boy. Then, he exhaled. "Your mother worked here as a maid. Years ago." The girl's hands tightened. "That doesn't explain why she abandoned us here." Mr. Laurent's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, it doesn't." A long silence stretched between them. The girl's mind raced. If their mother had worked here, why had she never mentioned it? Why had she left them at this mansion and vanished into the night? Then, the boy spoke again. "I remember a lady." The girl turned to him. "What?" The boy's face scrunched as he tried to recall. "A lady in a white dress. She used to sing to me." A chill ran down the girl's spine. She didn't remember anyone like that. Mr. Laurent's expression darkened. "Describe her." The boy frowned. "She was pretty. She had long hair, and she smelled like flowers." A tense silence filled the room. Mr. Laurent's fingers twitched. His usually calm demeanor cracked, just for a second. Then, in a voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, he said, "That's impossible." The girl swallowed hard. "Why?" Mr. Laurent looked at them both, his eyes unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was laced with something neither of them could place. "Fear? Regret? Because the woman you're describing has been dead for years." The girl's breath caught in her throat. "Dead?" she whispered. Her brother's eyes flickered with confusion. "But, I remember her. She used to sing to me." Mr. Laurent's face remained unreadable, but something in his gaze had shifted. He studied the boy carefully, as if seeing him in a new light. Then, he turned sharply and strode toward the door. "Follow me." The siblings hesitated before trailing after him. The hallway outside felt colder than before, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. Mr. Laurent walked with purpose, leading them down a different corridor, one that felt even older than the rest of the house. At the end of the hall stood a large wooden door, its surface carved with intricate patterns. Mr. Laurent pulled out an old key, slid it into the lock, and turned it with a heavy click. The door creaked open, revealing a grand but faded bedroom. The girl's breath hitched. A massive four-poster bed sat in the center of the room, draped with dust-covered silk. A dressing table stood against the far wall, its mirror cracked down the middle. The air smelled of aged perfume, faint but unmistakable. But the most unsettling thing of all was the painting above the fireplace. It was a portrait of a woman. She had long, flowing hair, a soft but melancholic expression, and wore an elegant white dress. The boy gasped. That's her. The girl's heart pounded. Mr. Laurent's voice was eerily quiet. Her name was Eleanor Laurent. My wife. The girl whipped around to face him. Your wife? Mr. Laurent nodded. His face was pale, his usual composure shaken. She died 10 years ago. The boy clutched his sister's arm. No, she didn't. I remember her. The girl shook her head, her pulse racing. That's impossible, he said. Her voice trailed off as something caught her eye. The mirror. At first, it was just a crack in the glass. But then, in the dim light, she saw it. Movement. A shadow. Something, or someone, was standing behind them. She spun around. Nothing. Just the empty room. But in the mirror, the shadow remained. And then, a voice, soft, melodic, almost like a lullaby, whispered through the air. You came back. The whisper echoed through the room. And the girl froze. The voice was unmistakable, soft, haunting, and familiar. It was the same voice her brother had described. The one that used to sing to him. Who's there? The girl asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Laurent's eyes flickered nervously. But he didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at the mirror, as though waiting for something. The boy's grip on his sister's hand tightened. I don't want to be here anymore, he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. The girl's heart raced, but she couldn't look away from the mirror. The shadow in it had shifted, now forming a shape, a figure standing just behind them. It was faint, like a smudge, but there was no mistaking it. The figure was tall, wearing a flowing white dress, just like in the portrait. Please, the boy whimpered, I want to go home. The girl shook her head, her mind racing. She didn't understand what was happening. But something was terribly wrong. The woman in the portrait, the voice in the air, the figure in the mirror, it was all connected. Then, the figure in the mirror began to move, slowly at first, like it was waking from a long slumber. The girl's breath caught in her throat as the woman took a step forward. Her eyes dark and hollow. She never left, Mr. Laurent said softly, his voice distant. The girl turned to him, confusion written all over her face. What do you mean? She's dead. No, Mr. Laurent said, his eyes filled with grief. Eleanor never truly left. She's been trapped here, in this house, for years, but she's not the only one. The girl's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Trapped? By who? Mr. Laurent looked at the painting again, his expression heavy with sorrow. It's not just her. Your mother, she made a deal. A deal with the house. With something far darker than we can understand. The girl's mind spun. A deal? What kind of deal? Mr. Laurent's voice broke. The kind that binds you forever. The air around them grew cold, and the woman in the mirror took another step forward, her face now clearly visible. Her eyes were hollow, lifeless, but there was something else there, something ancient and angry. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was cold, predatory. And then, in the eerie silence of the room, the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't sweet or melodic. It was sharp, filled with malice. You should have never come back. The door slammed shut, trapping them in the room. The door slamming shut was like a thunderclap. The sound reverberated through the room, and the girl's heart raced in her chest. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. She was trapped. Her brother whimpered in her arms, clutching her tightly. Sister, I'm scared. The woman in the mirror continued to move, her face growing clearer with each step. Her smile, twisted and cold, seemed to mock them. She was no longer just a reflection, she was real, standing just behind them, as if the glass was no longer a barrier. The girl felt the temperature drop, her breath now visible in the air. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally, pulling toward the figure in the mirror. It was like the house itself was alive, feeding off the fear in the air. We have to get out of here, the girl whispered, her voice shaking. Mr. Laurent, who had been silent until now, finally spoke again. You can't escape. The girl spun toward him. What do you mean? We have to. The house won't let you leave, he said, his voice broken. It doesn't let anyone go. Not those who make deals. And not those who uncover the truth. She took a step back, a cold realization dawning on her. What truth? What did my mother do here? Mr. Laurent's eyes were filled with anguish. Your mother, she wasn't just a maid. She was a key. She made a pact to keep this house alive. Alive in a way no one should understand. She made a sacrifice to keep it from decaying. To keep the power that keeps it running. But it cost her. And it cost everyone who's ever stepped foot in it. She didn't just leave you. She left to protect you from the curse. But it's too late now. You've entered the house's domain. The girl's chest tightened. Then how do we escape? But before he could answer, the woman in the mirror spoke again. Louder this time. You can't leave. Her voice was now hollow, echoing through the room like 1,000 voices crying in unison. The temperature plummeted even further, and the walls seemed to close in, suffocating them in a slow, relentless pressure. The house always claims those who come back, the woman whispered. Suddenly, everything clicked. The boy had recognized the mansion, not because of some past life, but because he had been here before in a forgotten time, one that wasn't supposed to exist. The girl took a deep breath. I won't let it take us. In a moment of clarity, she turned to the woman in the mirror, facing her head on. We won't be your prisoners. The woman's smile grew wider, and the shadows in the room surged forward, reaching for the girl and her brother. But the girl was ready. She grabbed her brother's hand and pulled him toward the window. With all her strength, she threw open the window. The cold night air rushed in, filling the room with a sense of freedom, of escape. Jump, she shouted. We have to get out of here. Now. Her brother didn't hesitate. Together, they leapt through the window, feeling the cold wind catch them as they fell toward the ground. As they hit the earth below, the mansion seemed to groan, as if in protest. The windows lit up with an eerie glow, the shadows inside writhing like they were alive. But they were free, for now. The girl looked up at the mansion, a sense of finality settling over her. She didn't know if they had broken the curse or if it would follow them forever. But one thing was certain, the house had claimed what it wanted. And they had escaped, for the moment.